I'm Winnie Bedigen. My research is based on peace building and, of course, development. I teach at Leeds and I teach modules both as at undergrad and postgrad levels. I'm interested in indigenous research, especially how customs norms are understood from the perspectives of the African people. So my research is based on the sub-Saharan region. Over to you, Lata.
Thank you, Winnie. So I'm Lata Narayanaswamy. I'm an associate professor in the politics of global development in the School of Politics and International Studies, along with Winnie at the University of Leeds. And I work around questions of whose knowledge counts. And I come to academia as a former practitioner, looking at questions of gender in particular, knowledge and power. And it's been a really interesting few years in that I've been able to work with lots of colleagues in a variety of topics, sort of climate change and menstruation and water security, and how this also links to questions of coloniality, decolonizing, and to think about those issues in a range of geographical contexts. So Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Asia. So it's a real privilege to be here and also to be having this conversation with you, Winnie, because I've had the privilege also of reading your research, which I find absolutely fascinating. And with that, it'd be great if you could kick off our conversation, because in particular, we have been brought together, I think, to explore questions of indigeneity, indigenous methodologies, co-production and participatory research. So Winnie, if you're able to enlighten us on these issues, that would be really great. So over to you.
Thanks a lot, Lata. I think one of the starting points would be how I actually use indigenous methods. In this regard, I probably want to highlight three things. The first one is that research is not an event. Research is often better seen as a dynamic and an iterative process. Then I think another thing probably I want to highlight is the knowledge creation. Knowledge creation is something that is deeply social. But often what we've seen, especially when we look at how research has been so much Western dominated, you'll find that the way we do our research is not normally deeply social. You'll find out, well, I'm not really a big fan of the structured interviews, etc., because I feel like, in the context kind of cultural way of researching things, that does not give you that rich knowledge, the data that you might need. Okay, so knowledge creation from various ingredients, for example, including by no means, issues that are limited to research, is therefore deeply social and contextual. Okay, so that means, a researcher, I think, has to go along with what actually works well within the community. It can be through things like, for example, interaction and dialogue, and that's what I've always used in my research. Then, of course, another one is just the process of it. So I don't normally just look at the product of the research, but I pay attention to the process of research. So this, I think, to me, makes more sense than just looking at the product. So it's very important that we pay attention to these three things: the process of research, the knowledge creation, which is actually deeply social, and then, of course, not looking at research as an event.
Yeah, thanks, Winnie. I mean, actually, you've raised so many interesting things there. And I think, in a way, the research cultures within which we work and how we are incentivized to behave in those research cultures, in a way, are really antithetical to thinking of knowledge creation as a social process. And I think that's a real limitation. But also, if we put the lens more widely, so we don't just think of co-production in the process of, say, field data, but if we were to widen the lens of problem identification, which is sort of sits at the heart of the sorts of research processes we undertake, I think that's a real limitation, because if we think about, for instance, how we go about applying for research money, or identifying our partnerships, for instance, we are asked in a way to run before we can walk, because we're not given, and you're smiling. So I don't know, this is going out in podcast form, so nobody can see the smile, but it is obviously your shared experience that I have as well, which is you're asked to identify a problem
Yeah.
but you're not really given resource to sort of talk to the people who might want to problem solve with you. You've got to, identify your impacts before you've done anything.
Yeah.
And how can you do that before you've had a chance to talk to the
Yeah.
people that you might co-produce with? And I think actually the thing that I find most striking, I think that assumption of homogeneity with the terminologies that we use, like the community or the local or the grassroots, actually is the danger is that becomes deeply problematic, especially when we aren't really given time to understand, who is in that space, right? Who is the community that you're going to work with, right? That these are diverse groups of people that are not only not homogenous, but will have their own internal power relations, right? And how do we work out who we're working with, what sort of, priorities might exist in that space, how those priorities get decided? I think those are real challenges. And certainly we need to be careful, I think, when we talk about things, as you say quite rightly, decolonization, for instance, that we don't fall into the traps of thinking of those terms as undifferentiated or homogenized, right? I think, because I'm also reflecting then on the legacies that might exist from research. And obviously, when we talk about co-production and we're sort of encouraged to think about the impact of our research, influencing policy is obviously one of the things that we're encouraged to do. But actually, I think what you've said is really interesting, because to think about co-production in the context of policy, I'm not sure that's a connection that's being made in a way, because I think there's a sense that you can co-produce knowledge, but it's meant to sort of stay in the community. And then it's only the elite stakeholders that have license to sort of talk in, big picture policy terms. And I think the way you've linked that's really, really interesting and actually quite clever, because what you're saying, if I've heard you correctly, is that co-production has to have a wider impact. It has to speak to decision makers. It can't just be something that you do in that local community and then you, as the sort of elite researcher, extract that for the purposes of policy that then exists elsewhere. Actually, co-production has to meaningfully speak to not just decision makers, but wider decision-making processes, because the communities that we are claiming to work with have to have voice in those places where what we might describe as power is being exercised. And I think that's really interesting, because my feeling, and you come in and tell me if you think I've misunderstood this, but my feeling is that the language of co-production tends to be used in relation to thinking about the community or that micro sort of small scale level, as opposed to thinking about co-production as something that has something important or meaningful to say within those bigger spaces where power is exercised. And I think that's a really nice connection to make, which is we as researchers have a responsibility to support the creation of enabling environments where multiple voices are then enabled to be heard, including in those spaces where decisions are made, where power is held, and maybe co-production itself has a role to play in not just creating enabling environments, but to disperse that power so that more people are able to be heard, are able to speak. I'm hesitant to use the word empowerment, because that sort of is like, we have some power to confer as if we are the power brokers, which I don't think as researchers we should be. But certainly something about co-production as being quite explicitly speaking to and with power, I think is actually very, very important. And then we are what, as researchers, we are the interlocutors maybe, but not in ways that center us.
Yeah, but actually, when you mention empowerment, it's actually a good term for you to use, because again, with empowerment, you can think about it the other way around in terms of co-production. It's like if you're talking about the community, you are engaging them, that's empowering them. So by co-production, then in my, for example, field of work, if I'm, for example, looking at something to do with the women engagement in conflicts or maybe land conflicts, remember, we've always said that women have been excluded from access to land, land rights. So these are cultural issues. They're not so much political issues in the sub-Saharan region. There's so much of cultural issues. So how do you engage these women in drafting policies that would help them get rid of these cultural barriers that actually exclude them from the ownership of land. So these are the sort of things that I would look at as a way of actually empowering them, helping them to know that they are actually empowered to actually think and find ways of safely navigating these cultures, the negative cultural values that actually prevent them from having rights of ownership to the land. And these are the very kind of issues that when we bring them to the table, when you research on them, then we involve the activists, we involve the policymakers, we involve the representatives of the communities to craft this into policies that can change the women experiences, especially when it comes to the ownership, empowerment, ownership of resources such as land.
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. So in other words, we can't think of co-production in isolation of broader processes of empowerment, I guess, is what you're saying.
Yes.
And I think that sounds eminently sensible. Whether our academic research cultures are geared towards that, I suppose, is a separate question. But maybe that has to be at least partly at the heart of any attempt to do what we're calling loosely decolonizing.
Oh yes, yeah.
I don't know if that sounds like a sensible sort of place to sort of conclude our thoughts in a way. Whether if co-production is to be meaningful and meaningful in the context of this broad space we're calling decolonizing, whether that sort of speaking to and with power has to be the place that we go. I don't know if that's something you would agree with.
Oh, yes, I do agree with you. In fact, when you look at decolonizing it is not just about learning. It's about unlearning matters as well. We've done research, like the way we started, we're talking about some of these theories, some of these practices in research that have long been there and we're still following them. So decolonizing would mean that it's probably time to unlearn some of these kind of procedures that we so much used to. But unlearning them would mean that we kind of have to have the knowledge, the ideas of what actually exists on the other side. Because now what I see is that, decolonization of whatever it is, knowledge, curriculum, it's more of a rhetoric kind of, idea. It's not so much about what is that, simply because, when you look at it actually, in reality, you find that when we talk about decolonizing, yes, there's a need to decolonize, but what next are we going to pick? What are we going to learn? And I think this is what makes indigenous research really very important, because unless some of these concepts are brought onto the light, then even if we talk about decolonizing, what are we going to pick up next? What are we going to turn to next? And the other challenge is that even if we think like, okay, maybe research should begin by knowing the community you're going to research about, but you also realize that these communities are not homogeneous. They are quite complex. I probably want to give an example of sometimes I've researched on the Dinka and the Nuer of South Sudan, and they are like cousins to each other. They more or less speak the same language. But then you find that there are certain things you might not know about the Dinka ethnic communities that the Nuer might actually tell you about. I don't know, maybe you have a better way of explaining how this decolonization will really hold some water. What will be the context of this decolonization if we do not know some of the content, what exists in the indigenous communities as we're going to research on.
Everything you just said was very solid to me, Winnie.
Yeah.
I think, this idea of contextual, situated knowledge, but also maybe, terminologies like pluriversal help us, the idea that we can live in, the Zapatista idea of a world of many knowledges. I think I'm slightly misquoting, but this idea of a world that can sustain many knowledges simultaneously is really, really important. And in a way, I think it sort of brings our conversation naturally to a close, in a sense that, co-production is only meaningful if there is space to accommodate.
Yes.
And we work out how to accommodate.
Yeah.
All of those knowledges. So yeah, that's been really, really enlightening, and it's really nice as well to get that insight into your research as well. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lata. Thank you for having me.